Reasons for judgment. The applicant, Mr. Djokovic, is a citizen of Serbia. He is currently the world's #1 ranked men's tennis player. Mr. Djokovic was issued a Class GG subclass 408 temporary activity visa on 18 November 2021 for the purpose of competing in the Australian Open Tennis Championship. That's right, listeners. Today, for our first episode of Series 3, back after a break over the New Year period, we are talking about the Australian Federal Court decision reviewing the decision to revoke Djokovic, the tennis star's visa. Calum Chain, are you there? Welcome back.
I'm here, I'm excited, and I'm glad to be kicking off with a matter of public interest.
Yeah, this is something different. One, I've got to say it's good to do an Australian case. I don't think we've done an Australian case yet, have we?
I think this is the first time we're back on home turf for you.
Yeah. So the case fits the accent. Two, it's a case I think just about everyone will have heard of, and I'm not going to say it split the field, but it definitely threw people to both sides on this one. And I know, having followed a lot of Australian news, although this was global news, that many people had different views on how the whole Djokovic affair was handled in Australia.
What I will say is that my view going into this podcast and going into reading the judgment was actually very different to my view having read the judgment.
Isn't that interesting? Well, let's get into that. For the tennis fans amongst our listeners, of course, this decision has huge significance at the moment as things stand, and this podcast is being recorded, I should be clear, before Rafa Nadal plays his semi-final against Berrettini on Thursday in Australia, but he's still in the running. At the moment, as the record stands, Novak Djokovic has won 20 Grand Slams, Roger Federer has won 20 Grand Slams, and Rafa Nadal has also won 20 Grand Slams. So whoever, if any of these, win another Grand Slam, the Australian Open being one of them, one of the 4 Grand Slams, if any of them win a Grand Slam next, then they will become the player who has won the most Grand Slams ever. Perhaps that's a measure of the best tennis player, at least men's tennis player, to ever have existed. So a lot on the line.
Tennis history at stake. And none of them are getting any younger.
They're not getting any younger. It's amazing when you think about the records. The next most Grand Slams on the men's side is Pete Sampras at 14. So it's just amazing that 3 players in a similar generation, although Djokovic has come in a little bit later, have achieved such sustained success over a long period of time. And also, if you think ahead, if Nadal were to win this Australian Open, and he did just get through his quarterfinal, so it'll be interesting to see how he pulls up for the semi-final overnight, and we might know the result of that by the time this podcast is published. But if he wins that, the next Grand Slam is, of course, the French Open, and we don't know whether Djokovic will be able to get to that one given visa issues, and you perhaps have some comments on that. But Nadal has such an amazing record on clay and playing at the French Open that it could, at least right now, it could be possible that Nadal gets 2 up on Djokovic and Federer by the time Djokovic, has another crown. So, yeah, it was a huge decision. You can see why Djokovic brought all his fighting prowess that he displays on the tennis court to arguing in court, and that's what we're going to get into.
And the court paid zero regard to any of that. Simply looking at this, it's a matter of law. But it is It is potentially shifting the dynamics of the debate for the greatest ever tennis player. And I think that what that goes to, though, in this case, is just the amount of public interest that was generated. And behind the case, the reason for the case, is a decision made by a member of the Australian government, which is made, Djokovic certainly argued, on very political grounds rather than necessarily lawful grounds.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a case that will take the lawyer listeners amongst us who studied administrative law at university back. I know I was kind of dusting off some of my old kind of concepts in this area around judicial review and the extent of that review. I think it's worth noting at the outset, this is not is it de novo review, or at least a review of the merits of the decision, where the court is looking at what the executive branch of government here, the Minister of Immigration and Home Affairs, they're not looking at the merits of the decision fresh. What they're looking for is they're looking at, in effect, whether the minister made some type of, whether they made some error at a very high threshold, like whether it was illogical, whether it was irrational, whether they were actually satisfied, whether there was a basis for the satisfaction that they could revoke the visa. So maybe it'll be useful just to unpack the actual relevant statutes that the minister was relying upon here, and then from there we can talk about the different language that's used in that section and unpack it and talk about what that means.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's, for anyone who studied law will remember some legislative scrutiny where they had to do a test looking through legislation and seeing what the words in the legislation mean. And this judgment felt like a essay response to quite a creative question for some kind of legislative analysis. And the legislation in question was the Migration Act 1958, sections 116 and sections 133C. And section 116, 1EI, says, subject to subsections 2 and 3, which are not relevant, the minister may cancel a visa if he or she is satisfied that the presence of its holder in Australia is, or may be, or would, or might be, a risk to the health, safety, or good order of the Australian community or a segment of the Australian community. And that's then that right, or the discretion of a minister under section 116 is then also impinged on by section 133C, which says the minister may cancel a visa held by a person if A, the minister is satisfied that a ground for cancelling the visa under section 116 exists. So it refers back to that requirement that the presence in Australia of the person is or may be a risk to the health of the Australian community. And separately, the minister is satisfied that it would be in the public interest to cancel the visa. So they're taking that one step at a time. There are essentially two limbs under section 133C that allow the minister to cancel the visa. The first is the minister's satisfaction that there's a ground for cancelling the visa under section 116. And the second is the minister's satisfaction that it's in the public interest to cancel the visa.
Yeah, and it's interesting looking at some of the history of Section 116 in that there was an amendment of that act in 2014 that actually lowered the threshold on this, may be or might be a risk to the public. Like they actually reduced the threshold, and there was an explanatory note that was accompanied with that, and it expressly said that the idea is to lower the threshold for that cancellation ground.
And it increases enormously the power that a minister has to cancel a visa of a person. And giving the game away slightly, I said at the start that my view had changed on this case from when I was first hearing about it in the news to when I read the decision. And my initial view was zero sympathy for Novak Djokovic. I thought if you're a tennis star traveling the world for tournaments, you've got a responsibility as an individual, a responsibility as a member of society, and a responsibility as a role model to take the lead on vaccination and to to show that, we can move back towards a world where travel is freer and easier, but there are these things that we can do individually as to be part of a collective society where we kind of bring ourselves back towards that world that we enjoyed in 2019. The main one is getting a vaccine. So I had no sympathy at all. Having read the decision, I have enormous sympathy for him. I think that this decision it's just a horrible outcome as far as I'm concerned. I think that one of the things
hang on, just to pick up on that, is it the decision itself that you have a complaint with, or is it the statutory scheme that there is in Australia and the power that is divested to the minister in these kinds of cases?
So that is something I was thinking about at length today when I was reading the case. It didn't sit easy with me at all, and I thought, is this a bad judgment where I disagree with what the judge has done in analysing these legislative sections, or is it an issue where I think that the power is lawfully used under these Australian laws, but I disagree with the use of it? And I came to the conclusion that it's both. I think that the judge could have done more. And this goes to one of the things in the case that I thought was most interesting, which is this idea of the minister's satisfaction being, quoting the judge, not an unreviewable personal state of mind. So where the legislation talks about the minister being satisfied, the judge can say, but were you satisfied? And the minister can't simply turn around and say, yes, I was satisfied, and therefore my satisfaction can be assumed. There are actually legal thresholds the minister has to pass in order for his satisfaction to be a valid satisfaction.
Yeah. Well, first I want to note that there are three judges. There's Justice also, Chief Justice of the Federal Court, Bosanko and O'Callaghan sitting. So we do have quite a weighty court sitting here, and as many will know, Australia is a federation. This is the federal level court, so quite a high court in the country. But it's an interesting concept, isn't it? This idea of what is lawful satisfaction, and the idea that the satisfaction, as you say, is not unreviewable. But when you then get into what the cases have said about how it's reviewed or what's the standard of review, it's a very high a high bar to review that satisfaction. And like, you've got concepts like that the minister must act in good faith. They cannot act merely arbitrarily or capriciously. They cannot act dishonestly. And then there's this phrase in the Bukat Bay decision where it says, so long as, however, as the minister acts upon circumstances giving him a rational ground for the belief entertained, then the courts of law cannot and ought not interfere. Giving him a rational ground for the belief, that's not a high bar at all for the minister to reach.
It's not. It's a very, very soft touch legislation from the minister's perspective that essentially delegates some of these kind of specific cases of immigration to the government. That's effectively the result of this legislation, is that the executive assumes to a certain degree power over the judiciary for issues relating to immigration of certain people, and the checks and balances that the judiciary is able to assert over the executive for those decisions are extremely marginal.
Yeah, and there's this illogical and irrational and legal unreasonableness test as well. But even that's also quite difficult. So you've got to say that the minister's decision was illogical, and they argue that. Djokovic did argue that in this decision, in talking about, you were only looking at the risk of inciting those that believe in non-vaccination, but you're not looking at the opposite, that if the visa is revoked, that it may increase groups that are supporting no vaccination, and that this kind of decision can actually incite the very type of people that you're looking to dissuade from taking the action that they are. So that fell on deaf ears. That didn't get any traction at all. It's not a test of, weighing up two logical polarities and going with one or the other. The minister just has to have a logical basis for making the decision that they have.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I think that the illogicality, I'm not sure whether it fits truly into the illogicality, but to me at least, there is a dishonesty in the Australian government's position here. And the reason I say that is that their concern is that Djokovic's presence in Australia is a risk to the health of the Australian community. They very early in their list of reasons why they wanted to remove Djokovic from the country, they said that they believed that he had COVID in December of 2021, and therefore their view is that he posed no risk of infection to other Australians. So their concern, the reason on which they've given this decision to remove him from the country, has nothing to do with the potential for Djokovic to infect or someone else with COVID, which he's more likely to get because he's not taken his vaccination. So the reason that they say that he needs to leave the country is that his presence being there, him playing in the Australian Open, him presumably conducting interviews and everything else, is going to embolden a part of society that doesn't want to get a vaccine. And that, in turn, is a significant danger to the health of the Australian community. Now, I agree that large portions of the population not being vaccinated is a significant risk to the health of the population at large. What I find difficult to reconcile is that you're entirely within your rights in Australia not to be vaccinated. There's no mandatory vaccination. And if the government feels strongly that mandatory vaccination is the way to protect the entirety of its population, then I think the government has to legislate for that and say this is a genuine public health risk. And the way we mitigate this public health risk is mandatory vaccination, and take the flack that comes with that from their voter base, from whoever else, but actually pin their colours to the mast and say, we will take the actions needed to protect the entire population, which are that we cannot have anywhere in society a conversation about avoiding the vaccine. But whereas what they've done is they've said, actually, if you don't want to get vaccinated, you don't have to get vaccinated. We won't compel you to. We'll do all sorts of social coercion to encourage people to get vaccination, which in my view is completely the right thing to do. But we're not going to tell you that it's necessary. But what we will do is prevent somebody else from coming into the country. In fact, we'll deport somebody who's made it into the country on the basis that they may share a viewpoint with those people who we are not requiring to get vaccinated. There's a tension and an illogicality to that, which underneath this decision, what this decision slightly exposes to me is a slight hypocrisy in the stance of not just the Australian government, but many governments that don't want the negative publicity that comes with saying you must be vaccinated, but that's really what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, exactly. Look, you've touched on the politics there behind it, and I think it's undoubtedly a decision in terms of the minister decision that you can't not look at the political situation, and let's not go all the way down exploring Australian politics, but there have been a number of issues around implementation of COVID-related measures in Australia. Some that I suppose, you could describe them as social coercion, but some of them do have force of law. And, if there have been lockdowns and people are breaching lockdowns, then you do have the weight of the law behind them. But you're right in that there's no mandatory vaccination regime in Australia. There have been some countries that have gone down that route, but there's a lot of kind of visibility on Djokovic coming into the country, not being vaccinated, going to Victoria, which is a state that has had some very severe lockdowns and as has many parts of the world. And as a part of coming out of lockdowns, there's been a real push to get vaccinated. And so the idea of someone waltzing in who, has decided not to get vaccinated kind of flies in the face of a lot of the, as you describe it, social coercion that the government has been doing. Now, how that plays out here, I think you're right to be concerned about the decision. I think you're right to be concerned about the outcome. I'm not sure I have as many complaints about the court's decision as you might. I think this is largely set up from a statutory platform, and immigration issues in Australia have been controversial for many, many years, decades, and not just in a pandemic COVID-19 situation, but with all sorts of immigration issues over the years. And there have been issues around the extent of ministerial power in making decisions on the risk of people coming into the country. And you can see that this is a real life example around an individual coming in to play a tennis match, ultimately. And we can all talk about how much value should be placed on that. But you have the same type of power being used in situations where refugees are fleeing. And I don't mean to get into refugee law or the minutiae of it, but you can see how a minister of immigration looking at other situations and wanting to find reasons politically to deport someone has quite a lot of room to maneuver with the lowering of that threshold of 116 sexual.
That's exactly what I was thinking when I was reading this. That it's not really about Djokovic. Djokovic is someone who I really struggle to have much positive to say about, apart from his tennis playing, because the way that he acted around this was just, it was awful. He found out he had COVID, and the next day he was conducting an interview with the French newspaper. I mean, those kind of things are just so such flagrant abuses of the whatever laws are in place, but also just abuses of the way that the international community has tried to move on from the pandemic. So I think as an individual, I just don't really have much time for him. I think that he's acted in all the wrong ways. But what this decision shows and really, really highlights is the strength of executive power on immigration matters in Australia. So much so that it was very hard for them to actually pin down a specific anti-vaccine comment from Djokovic with respect to COVID. He's obviously under enormous pressure from his PR team. He actually hasn't really said anything that is anti-COVID. That's anti-vaccine. So when you're trying to discern this factual suspicion that the government minister has, he's kind of relying on saying, well, at the end of the day, we know he's not vaccinated, and previously he's shown some skepticism towards vaccinations generally, and therefore we think that he's going to be a figurehead for a anti-vaccination movement against COVID-19. I suppose we all kind of know from the media generally that Djokovic is fairly, he's regarded as being anti-vaccine by the anti-vax lobby and by all these people who are themselves anti-vax. And I'm sure that, I'm not sure. I can't really be sure, but I strongly suspect that personally he is anti-vaccine, and the fact that he's not been vaccinated strongly suggests that. But he's publicly not really done anything to provoke anti-vax, to provoke any anti-vaccine sentiment. He's just been quite quiet on it, and he's not been pro-vaccination. And in a country where not being vaccinated is a legitimate, lawful thing to do, it strikes me as a real stretch of executive power to say that you existing here without being vaccinated, which is lawful in our country, is enough for you to be deported. Now, one issue that they didn't go into in this judgment, but that I didn't really understand, was how he got in the first place. Because I think if a country was to say we only accept people who have proof of vaccination into our country, then it's very difficult to argue with that. But the decision here was not at all about the fact that he was in the country without being vaccinated, or that he'd got through the border without being vaccinated. The decision here solely related to the minister being satisfied that Djokovic presented a threat to the health of the Australian community. And it's not something that I've actually read into originally, but it seemed like he had some exemption through his previous COVID diagnosis that allowed him to enter the country.
Well, that was one of the criticisms made about the whole affair, and that the opposition in Australia took up, was that the visa shouldn't have been granted in the first place. If this was the view you were going to take, there was nothing that happened I think it was granted, I could be wrong, but around November time, the visa was granted in the first place. There's nothing that really happened in December and January that changed Djokovic's view. He didn't come out in December saying, I'm an anti-vaxxer. That all kind of predated that decision. So if the government was going to go down, or the minister was going to go down this route, then that decision could have been made much earlier and before Djokovic jumped on a plane. There were a whole lot of questions around, technical type questions around the issuing of the visa, whether he did have a suitable exemption or not, whether there was a false declaration on that application. Those were issues dealt with in the prior court decision, which Djokovic prevailed on, and largely prevailed on because he wasn't afforded procedural fairness in having an opportunity to address those technical issues, because it was a delegate of the minister issuing a different type of power. In any event, Djokovic prevailed on that, and then it turned on. So after that decision, the minister then made this decision. And so you can see it's almost like a second bite of the cherry, using executive power at its highest to make almost an opinion or policy-based decision to revoke the visa of Djokovic. And it has parallels. I can't remember the situation, but I have this recollection of these types of decisions being made with respect to like entertainers or performers.
Was it Johnny Depp? Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, I think they came in with their pet dogs.
Well, that was with the dog, but that was a non-disclosure issue, wasn't it? They didn't disclose that they had the dog with them on their private jet or something like that. And
that was it. They hadn't given they didn't have the right permissions because they hadn't said they were bringing their dogs in.
The funny thing about that, Amber Heard, apparently, I read this somewhere, so it could be complete rubbish, probably, but Amber Heard, I think, put on Twitter that she named her most recent dog Barnaby Joyce, which is the deputy leader of the government in Australia.
That's great.
So they've got a Barnaby Joyce dog running around now. Oh, not they, because I don't think they're together, are they? But anyway, no. we are massively digressing.
Hugely. I think that there was this initial decision, and basically the whole thing seemed like it had got to the point where it was just such a mess that the Home Office, or the Home Office equivalent, felt like they had to step in and say, like, you're going home. It's exposed, in my view, or it probably was exposed to people. It certainly was exposed to people who had good knowledge of this before. But to me, as a kind of layperson reading the decision for the first time, or a lay Australian person reading the decision for the first time, it really highlighted the strength of the Australian executive over these immigration issues. And for Djokovic, it's just too bad. No one's going to lose too much sleep over Novak Djokovic's cause. I don't think he's put himself in this position and could have easily not been in this position had he just followed sensible medical advice. But powers of this nature that are so difficult for the court to check always make me feel slightly uncomfortable.
Well, you're having this conversation in an American setting with freedom of speech enshrined in the Constitution. It's the idea. What we have here is we have someone being deported from the country, but not being allowed into a country because of views held, not doing much really to incite the views of followers, not being at the at the front of a protest or putting out lengthy protestations about vaccines and things like that. But clearly, I think holding this view, or at least through his behaviour, holding this view on a few comments here and there. But for someone, for their own free speech is being excluded on health grounds, and that it's a risk to society. And I do have a recollection that there's been like I don't know whether it was someone who was fascist or something like that, singer, I want to say, or one of these. Oh, I know what it might have been. It might have.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. It was a right-wing speaker who was famously outspoken against the LGBTQ plus
Yeah,
community.
yeah,
And that, okay, in that situation, I can see I can see the use of this sort of legislation, because in that situation, you're saying your presence in Australia is creating these gatherings that may be a risk to the health of the Australian community, or part of the Australian community being the LGBTQ plus community. And there's a very direct link between someone who is essentially practicing hate speech towards a part of the community and a satisfaction that presence may be a risk to that. This seems like it's going a long way further, and it's saying this is somebody who all they're doing is being silent on the topic, but personally has decided that they want to take the position the government doesn't like, but the government has not outlawed, in not getting a vaccine, and that's enough to send them home.
yeah. Yeah, I see that.
But
And there is
about.
still a question. One of the issues that I had when I thought about this decision is the presence in Australia point. Like, how much does it really change the analysis for Djokovic's presence in Australia to cause this type of harm? Does it really raise it because he goes and plays in the Australian Open and keeps his mouth shut? Not that, the ministers to know whether he would keep his mouth shut or not.
I thought the same thing. Is his presence in Australia what is causing the risk? What's the risk, really? I don't know. This is why I felt a bit uneasy with it. There are a number of unanswered questions, and at the end of the day, it was so easy for the minister just to be satisfied in his decision.
But isn't that, if you had to take, let's put a hypothetical hat on, if you had to take this to appeal, let's say Djokovic wanted to appeal it, or there was time to appeal it before the tournament started, because remember, this decision was given, I think, the day before, or the 2 days before the actual Australian Open started, so there was no time to appeal, really. But if you had to take this on appeal, one of the areas that I thought of is this presence in Australia aspect, and I thought of it from almost picking up the arguments about logicality or illogicality. And when he was making this argument about, well, this decision may actually increase pro-anti-vaxxers just as much as letting Djokovic into the country. It's almost, I can see why they're going at it from an illogical basis, because that's a basis upon which you can then criticize the satisfaction, Lynn. But it seems to me that it's also an argument on the presence in Australia point.
As in a world where everyone is so interconnected, and Djokovic's ability to change people's opinion comes not just from him playing tennis, but also him posting on social media and doing all sorts of other things. The effect in Australia of Djokovic expressing anti-COVID vaccination views, were he to do that, wouldn't be contingent on him being in Australia. His presence in Australia wouldn't really make a difference.
Yeah, exactly. And but also the fact that this decision has been made may lead him to make more comments in favor of anti-vaxxers, because this is all, we're dealing in a lot of hypotheticals in this case as to what he may or may not do. So then if this decision is made, he's not allowed in, and he then comes out in support of anti-vaxxers, then how is the presence in or out of Australia really being affected by the views that he holds? I just, that's the area where I struggled a bit with it. Ultimately, I think that the court came to the right decision on the law and on the statutory scheme that was before them, and the judicial opinions that there have been on the test that is to be applied by a court looking at the ministerial power. I tend to think the minister's power is too broad. But just before we finish off, should we just touch on the three grounds ultimately, like that the court dispensed with the decision?
Yeah, so we've kind of gone through these a number of times in the round, but it's worth just kind of hitting the nail on each so that we cover it all. And these are basically the three grounds of complaint that the court found against Djokovic on. In each case, the court disagreed. The first was this illogicality, irrationality, unreasonableness of the approach, and the court said that no, there were kind of cogent logical reasons behind the decision behind the satisfaction of the minister to cancel the visa. The second ground was that it wasn't open to the minister to find, as a matter of fact, that the presence of Djokovic in Australia would be a risk to the health or the good order of the country, of the Australian community. And there they were saying that in order to make a finding of fact, there had to be some evidence. And this is the point that I was talking about earlier, where actually although the world knows Novak Djokovic to be a likely vaccine skeptic or anti-vaxxer, he's not really made any comment other than saying that he thinks that individuals should have their own choice in vaccination. He's been very, very quiet on the question of vaccination. So they were saying, well, in the absence of any information, you can't simply now make a finding that he is going to be a risk to the health of the Australian community. And the third was that it wasn't open to make a finding concerning his well-known stance on vaccination for similar reasons, that he didn't have a well-known stance on vaccination because he'd really been very quiet on it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, look, thank you for that roundup, Calum. I found this, from a legal perspective, a very interesting case, and one that is so, connected with or explores the limits of judicial power and executive power, highlights how in this instance the executive can have quite broad discretion to make certain decisions that it wants for political reasons. And when it does, the courts have their hands tied as to what they can and cannot do. Yes, a minister cannot act dishonestly, they cannot act capriciously, they cannot act in bad faith. But that's a high bar to question a minister's decision. So it also is a decision that I think has broad application or broad significance in other areas of immigration law. And, as we opened up, it may have big consequences in the world of tennis. We shall see on the weekend what happens in the Australian Open if Nadal gets through Thursday's semi.
I've always been a big Nadal fan, so I'm hopeful that he ends up with the most of the three of them.
So you should really be cheering on this decision, shouldn't you, Calum?
I think my view on it really is Djokovic should never have been playing on the Australian Open. The Australian people have done so many lockdowns, they've been through so much, and it was pretty insulting for someone who himself is clearly not vaccinated to think that he could come into the country and play in a tournament that the Australian people are putting on. But when you get really into the granular of what the minister's decision was, then it becomes a little bit hard to stomach, I think, the way the decision was ultimately made.
Well, on that note, until our next one, thank you for coming back for Series 3. We hope you've enjoyed this case, a bit of an off-piste one for us, but I know we've both thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for your time today. Please do subscribe and follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and if you already have, thank you for joining us. Our numbers keep going up, so we're really delighted by the patronage. So thank you. We've got some interesting guests coming in. We can say that we are broadening our horizons and starting to bring in guests who are external to ZFZ. So tune in next week for our first external guest.
Cheers, everybody. Cheers, Luke.